World Regions, Geography, Sub-Saharan Africa, Part 3. We're continuing with the historical legacies and landscapes. We were talking about European settlement. You see here there was in the 15th, 16th century, you had Portuguese coming along here. You then had the Dutch settling in South Africa down here. That's the Boers and the Afrikaners. That's in this region down here in South Africa. This kind of started to open up Africa, and then by the 1850s is when you began the exploration of this central African region in here. You had the Victorian explorers, Livingstone and Stanley coming up looking for the headwaters of the Nile. You had people going up the Congo, the Belgians claiming the Congo, and then you had this all of a sudden Berlin Conference 1884, 1885, where Germany, the Dutch, the British, and the French and the Italians decided to how they were going to carve up Africa, how they were going to colonize it. And that began the real colonial experience in Africa, where you see native peoples displaced, you see the emergence of plantation economies, rubber was a major export, coffee, sugar, slaves. Slaves had been an export for quite a time. By 1850, the slave trade had pretty much disappeared in Africa, so there wasn't anything going on there. But it was really the dividing up, and a lot of these countries, these nation states that exist today in Africa, came out of this Berlin Conference, and they really didn't pay a lot of attention to native culture, to native ethnicities, to animosities between various tribal groups. They just drew a line. This is where we want it. People on this side belong to me. The people on that side belong to you. And that's pretty much the way it went. And consequently, a lot of the problems you see in Africa, if you think of the genocide in Rwanda, what's going on here in South Sudan, this region, you have Arab Sudanese, and in this region, Black Sudanese. And that's where the genocide was coming from, this group trying to kill off this group. So in Rwanda, you saw between two tribes, and this genocide continues throughout this region because it has not really outlived its colonial legacy. The colonial legacy is those arbitrary political boundaries that you see here. Belgian Congo. If you've ever read anything about the the Congolese experience, basically King Leopold in Belgium took this right here up the Congo River and turned this into one giant plantation, enslaved the entire population, and anybody who resisted was killed, and it was pretty brutal. That ended in the 60s with killing of Dutch in the cities and finally becoming independent countries. The extraction and export, and what they mean by this is colonialism is basically an economic and political and cultural subversion of local cultures and peoples, and it's for the purpose of extracting wealth. Now, usually this extracted wealth was in the form of commodities, raw materials. So you would have things like plantations, you would have large mining companies that would not care about what happened. It changed agricultural practices in this region of Africa. It changed the type of crops. It made food scarce. because people were used to farming in a certain manner, raising their food. Well, now this land was grabbed and turned into large plantations. So these European colonial policies had a lot to do with poverty throughout this region here, particularly of native peoples. So you had this real dichotomy. Europeans were wealthy, native peoples were very poor. Independence movements. So you have these transitions. And most of this, for the most part, was post World War II. So right after the war, starting in World War I, when the British, French, Belgian, the Germans um, were involved in World War I, they brought troops from all of their colonies, but a lot of troops out of Africa into Europe. They fought in World War I, again in World War II. And after World War II, the British, French, Belgian, uh, and Italian power in Africa was pretty much gone. And so you began to see a movement by nationalists within these colonial entities to begin to create nation states of the former colonial properties in Africa. You began to see like um, the Belgian Congo was very violent. The French, very violent. The British were more, they gave up a lot of the colonies, gave them independence without as much fighting. But the French in Algeria, there was a long civil war. The Belgians in the Congo was very bloody. The Portuguese in the 80s, Angola and uh, the Portuguese colonies broke away. That was quite a bit later. They held on to their colonies for quite some time. Dependency and debt. One of the things that happened when Africa broke away, you have these despots, and they concentrated the wealth in their hands, often getting it out of Africa into Europe where they could escape if they needed to. There was tremendous amount of debt. They tried to modernize using the Western model, which wasn't very successful. In some places, they took land from white farmers who had been farming the land and gave it back to blacks. And so you had, in some countries like Zimbabwe, that had been the breadbasket of Africa, in a very short period of time, went from exporting food to not having enough food to feed their own people and no wealth and no money. The G8, which is the group of countries, the 8 largest economies in the world, kind of dictate terms of trade. And the problem that you have in Africa and anywhere in the world where there are primary goods, in other words, if you're exporting crops that you're growing or things that you're taking out of the ground, whether it's oil or whether it's iron or whether it's any kind of mineral wealth, you're exporting it somewhere, China, the US, Europe, to sell for that area to manufacture goods and ship back. And these manufactured goods always cost considerably more. So one measure of trade imbalance is the change in what it costs to, say, buy a refrigerator, say in 1990, and what it costs in 2000 in terms of what you're trading, whether that's bananas, oil, or minerals. If it takes a pound or 1,000 pounds of bananas to be able to pay for a refrigerator in 1990, and then it takes 2,000 pounds of bananas to buy the same refrigerator in 2000, the cost is 50% higher. And the problem with primary goods is it's not easy to increase production. There's not a lot of efficiencies in order to be able to produce extra goods. Now, some countries have tried import substitution. We've talked about that in the past. Import substitution is that they put a tariff on imported goods in order to be able to support a localized industry. So maybe there's a local plant that's making these refrigerators, and they may not be as high a quality, they may not be the most modern systems, but you can buy them for 2,000 pounds of bananas, and with the tariff on the imported ones are now 3,000 pounds of bananas, so that it increases purchasing of localized products by inflating the price of imported. It hasn't been successful in the past because typically, even when a company like GE or somebody goes in there and sets up a plant, they produce older technology, which is cheaper to produce, but it's also less efficient. And generally, they do it through licensees to to locally owned companies. That's how the import substitution works, is they find locally owned companies, and these companies typically don't have the manufacturing expertise that the large foreign manufacturers have, and consequently the goods are lower quality and older technology, and people who can afford it still pay more and get the premium imported goods, and they tend to not work real well. Import substitution doesn't. Agricultural challenges and opportunities. So there's yield gaps. There's big differences in the yield. Here you see laborers working in a greenhouse, and here you see an individual trying to grow food. And one of the problems you have in Africa is people cannot afford to buy the food produced in these large plantations owned by foreigners who can afford to fertilize and insecticides. They can produce 100 pounds of bananas much cheaper than this individual working by hand can do, and consequently these people get squeezed out. They can't survive. And so what you have is simply subsistence farming. And subsistence farming is simply means that you consume whatever you grow. So if you have a good year, you may eat well. If you have a bad year, you may not eat at all. Commercial farming, primarily owned by foreign corporations, large scale, a lot of fertilizers used, wealth extraction. Land grabs is simply the consolidation of land. So you have large corporations coming in, buying up land, consolidating it into these large plantation farms for export. Urban agriculture, this is what you see going on right here, by the way. You see the urban area here? It's simply taking advantage of any vacant land space, whether it's behind your house or it's a little sliver of land next to a roadway where they may grow some crops in order to feed themselves and their families. The fair trade movement